Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to the last new presentation on material on the Civil War, and the only new presentation you have to worry about this week in terms of the module of work that you're working through. Okay, now we've been through the Civil War. We talked about the debate over free states versus slave states all the way back in the 1850s and 1820s. Keeping that balance between free states and slave states in the Union. We talked about the election of Lincoln in 1860, which is going to start the ball rolling. We talked about abolitionists in the North that were beginning to push for the end of slavery. We talked about the secession of South Carolina, the opening shots at Fort Sumter, Lincoln's call for volunteers, which leads other Southern states to rebel and leave the Union. We talked about the first battle of Bull Run, the turning point at Gettysburg. We mentioned the Battle of Antietam and the resulting Emancipation Proclamation. So we've come a long, long way in our discussion of all things Civil War. And we're going to end that discussion today by looking at the legacy of the war. Now, don't forget, the war officially ends on April the 9th, 1865, with the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Virginia's kind of a big deal. We had two major wars end within our borders, okay? The American Revolution ended at Yorktown, and the American Civil War is going to end at Appomattox Courthouse. But when we talk about the legacy of the war, we got to talk about this man right here, Abraham Lincoln. The war started with him, and the war, in some respects, is going to end with him as well. Now, today we're going to mention Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on April the 14th, 1865. He was attending a play called Our American Cousin. Okay, and the picture here is of the theater after he was assassinated. The black ribbons and the black bunting there are memorial ribbons because he died from the wounds of his assassination. He will be shot on April the 14th, but he will die on April the 15th. Okay, and the man that shoots him is John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth snuck into the theater. He shot Lincoln behind. The bullet came in through behind one of the ears, traveled through the president's brain, and comes to rest in the front of his head on the other side. Booth then leaps off of the president's box onto the stage below and escapes. He will make it to Virginia, where he will be captured by federal troops. And of course, he ends up getting killed in a barn fire. He's shot, and then the barn is set on fire. They drag Booth's body out, and he dies a little bit later after that. But this is John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln. But the legacy of the war really doesn't begin with Lincoln's assassination. It begins in 1865, early 1865, at Lincoln's second inaugural address. Okay, now this picture is Lincoln's second inaugural address. Lincoln is right here giving this address. Now, what's interesting is if you look down here, these gentlemen right here are some of Booth's co-conspirators. And there's another statue, kind of like this one, on the other side of the Capitol building. And if we could enlarge this photograph, we could look in front of that statue and you would see John Wilkes Booth. Okay, so John Wilkes Booth and some of his co-conspirators are here at Lincoln's second inaugural. Now, the reason I say the legacy of the war begins here is because of what Lincoln said. Now, I know this is not on your notes if you're using the worksheet that I gave you, so please copy these down, okay? You might want to type them at the end or something like that. But at the second inaugural address, Lincoln says something very, very big. He says, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds." Okay, that's from his second inaugural address. And we talked a little bit last week about his plans after the war is over. Lincoln thought that secession was illegal. According to the Constitution, that's what he interpreted as secession was illegal. And since secession is illegal and you can't do it, the Confederate States are really illegitimate. They never really left the Union. Okay, and I use that example of a family. There are all these different members of the family, and sometimes family members get upset with each other and they might go leave for a while, but they're still part of the family. And hopefully, at some point in time, they will come back. It might take a couple hours. It might take a couple days, maybe even longer. But they're still part of the family, and hopefully they will come back. When Lincoln says, with malice towards none, with charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds, what he is saying is he wants to restore the former Southern states quickly with no punishment. Okay? He mentions it a little bit in the Gettysburg Address, too. I want to bring these people back and move forward together. If we punish them, that is going to continue the division, and we need to be healing the nation and moving forward together. Unfortunately, we're not able to see what would have happened had Lincoln lived and had this policy been carried out. Because 5 days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth while he was attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Now, like I said, the play was called Our American Cousin. It was a comedy at the time. Okay. Lincoln was sitting in the president's box with his wife, Mary, and two guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancee, Clara Harris. Booth had snuck up the day earlier in the day and had kind of made preparations. He had carved a little hole in the door to the president's box so he could see into it. Okay. During the play, he knew the exact point in time. There was a line. There was one actor on stage, and he made this comment: "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You snot dazzling old man trap," which in 1865 is hilarious. And all these people started laughing, and Booth waited to that moment to come into the president's box, shoot President Lincoln. He cuts Henry Rathbone with a knife. In fact, Rathbone almost loses his arm. In fact, when doctors get to the box, they think Rathbone is the more serious case than President Lincoln. And then Booth jumps to the stage and escapes out the back of the theater. The next day, the president dies, April the 15th, 1865. His body is taken across the street to the Peterson boarding house, and that will be where he passes away on April the 15th, 1865. After that, his body lays in state in Washington for a couple days, and then it goes back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. All along the way, there's this massive funeral train that actually goes back along the route that Lincoln took to come to D.C. to get inaugurated. All along the way, about 7 million people, which is almost a third of the Union population, okay, they turn out to pay their respects to Lincoln's funeral train as it goes by. When Lincoln passed, his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, was in the room, and Edwin Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Okay, when Lincoln passed, there's that famous comment, "Now he belongs to the ages." Now, sadly, where we're going to pick up, we're going to leave the story there for right now. Next week, we're going to pick it up with Reconstruction, because now that Lincoln's gone, how is this malice towards none, charity for all, how is that going to be lived out? All right. What is going to happen to the South now that Lincoln is dead? And to be honest with you, Booth claims that he shot Lincoln because he was doing something good for the South. He wanted the South to rise again. This is probably the most serious blow the South is going to face, because without Lincoln there to guide Reconstruction, it becomes a horrible mess. And now those that are in charge are going to be very, very vindictive toward the South because of Lincoln's assassination. Okay, so we're going to pick up with the story there next week. Now, let's talk more about this impact on American society. All right, we're going to look at the legacy of the war. We're going to talk about political changes. We're going to talk about economic changes. We'll talk about the human cost of the war and changes for African Americans. All right. Now, in terms of political changes, one thing that's never happened since the Civil War, no state has ever threatened secession again. I want to clarify this a little bit. No state has ever seceded again. There have been states to threaten secession, probably not as serious as what we saw in the Civil War, but no state has ever seceded again. The next thing, and it's a positive or negative depending on who you are, the federal government becomes more powerful and it becomes a bigger part of our everyday lives. And we got two examples of that. Number one, it passes conscription. That's the draft. All males, when they turn 18, have to sign up for the draft. Okay, that is an example of the government becoming a bigger part of your daily life. Okay, now you have to sign up for the draft. We've used the draft in World War One, World War Two. A lot of times they would draft people in during times of war, but we hadn't had this forcing you to sign up for it before. Okay, there's never been this forceful you've got to sign up for it before. So this is one example of the government becoming a bigger part of everyday lives. And number two, we get the income tax. Okay, to raise money for government programs. After the Civil War, we see the passage of the income tax. Or during the Civil War, actually, we see the passage of the income tax. But again, this is another example of the federal government become a bigger part of your everyday life. Now, in terms of the economic changes, we're going to talk more about this next, or in the next unit after Reconstruction, we're talking more about this. We get a national railroad system. That is something that we'd wanted before the Civil War. The Civil War kind of disrupts a lot of plans for expansion, especially expansion out west. And we're going to pick up with that after the war is over. And one of the things that we pick up with is a national railroad system, especially something called a transcontinental railroad. Okay, and we'll talk more about that later. It also creates a new national banking system. Remember, we talked about the Bank of the United States and the fact that the Bank of the United States gets killed by Andrew Jackson. Well, guess what? It's coming back. Okay, we realize we need a national bank to kind of control finances for the country and kind of provide some stability for the country. So we get a new national banking system. The northern economy is booming. It flourishes with industry. Remember, the North is going to be associated with industry, with factories. We talked about that before the war with the economic differences. Well, it's going to come back in a big way after the war. In fact, the northern economy is going to be a flourishing global economy. We are going to see the United States enter into the global economic system thanks to the industry of the North. The South is not going to do so hot, okay? Remember, the Southern economy is based on agriculture, okay? It's going to collapse. It's going to be devastated. It's awful. Number one, there's no more labor, especially no more slave labor for the plantations because the 13th Amendment is going to get rid of slavery, okay? Farms are going to be destroyed. Farms are going to lay in ruins. A lot of the fighting took place in the South. Sherman, when he marched through Georgia, he's going to destroy all these farms and things like that so the Confederacy can't use it against the Union Army. So the South is just really, really devastated, and it is going to remain poor for decades to come. In fact, some people would argue it is still dealing with the effects of the Civil War, the negative effects of the Civil War, and we are still trying to rebuild and recover from this period of time, even today in the 21st century. Okay, so the South is going to be devastated. The agricultural economy is in shambles, and it's going to be that way for several decades. Now, in terms of the human cost of the war, around 600,000 soldiers are killed. Okay, 600,000 people are killed. I talked about this. More people, more Americans are going to die in the Civil War alone than in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Battle for Texas Independence, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam combined. We have 600,000 killed. We have around 500,000 wounded. And to be honest with you, those numbers are continuing to increase. Okay. I think one estimate I saw was about 605,000 died, and a little more than 500,000 were killed. Okay, so those numbers continue to go up. All right, with that many casualties, 10% of the nation's population served in the military. That means they left jobs, farms, family behind, and now those guys have to come back and rebuild. And part of the reading that you had last week was talking about how hard that is, because a lot of these people that are coming back are going to be dealing with devastating wounds, and they're going to be expected to come back and return to these jobs and these farms and these families, and they're going to be broken men. All right, so there's all kinds of emotional problems, economic problems, psychological problems, things like that, dealing with these wounded after the war. To give you an idea of how big a thing this is, 1/5 of Mississippi's state budget, that is the total amount of money to run the state of Mississippi, education, roads, government, all the money that we pay for all that stuff, 1/5 of that budget was spent on artificial limbs for returning veterans, guys that had lost arms and legs and hands and things like that. We're going to give them artificial limbs. 1/5 of the Mississippi state budget, the total amount of money used to run the state of Mississippi, went to pay for artificial limbs. Now, one of the biggest groups that's going to be impacted, of course, is African Americans. It is going to take a while. Their lives begin to change on paper. And it is very, very significant. I don't want to downplay it, but keep in mind, it's going to take a while. In fact, people are going to argue it's going to take us until the civil rights movement, until the 20th century, that we actually begin to see some physical change, okay? And again, we're going to pick up with this more when we get to Reconstruction. We talk about the failure of Reconstruction. The biggest thing is the passage of the 13th Amendment, which comes in 1865. You had the Emancipation Proclamation that went into effect in 1863. It was supposed to free slaves in rebelling states. It doesn't, because the South is not going to pay attention to them, and it doesn't say anything about the slaves in the North or in the border states. All of that is going to disappear with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment will officially abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. And it's significant that it's passed in 1865 because we had to win the war to prove that was going to happen. Okay, Lincoln knew he had to win the war to prove it was going to happen. All right. So with the 13th Amendment, slavery is officially abolished in the United States. Now, that's going to pave the way for the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says you cannot deny civil rights. You cannot deny the rights of a citizen to anybody based on race, color, religion, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so basically it's going to give civil rights and the rights of citizens to African Americans. It's also going to pave the way for the 15th Amendment, which is going to give African American men the right to vote. Okay, it says the right to vote shall not be infringed upon based on race, creed, color, that sort of thing. Okay, women aren't included yet. Okay, women aren't included yet, but it's going to pave the way for those two other key amendments. Now, the last part here, I want to answer some questions. Okay, I want to discuss some questions. Again, these aren't on your sheets, so you might want to jot them down, or at least just pay attention as we go over them and stuff like that. These are kind of the high points that I want to be sure we hit. Okay. Number one, what economic impact did the Civil War have on the South? Well, we already talked about it. It is devastated. Farms, railroads, factories have all been destroyed throughout the South. I want to be sure that I pinpoint this. The cities of Richmond and Atlanta lay in ruins. Not just Richmond and Atlanta, but Richmond and Atlanta kind of get the most attention because they were major governmental hubs. They were major economic hubs, transportation hubs. They were very, very important cities, and they lay in ruins. Okay, and you're going to see some questions on the final test and on the quiz and stuff like that. What two cities in the South were completely burned to the ground and completely destroyed after the Civil War? It's Richmond and Atlanta. So the economy has been devastated because of the war, and for decades after the war, what long-term impact did that have on the South? The South remains backwards, okay? It still holds tight to that agriculturally based economy. That is going to be very, very difficult to overcome, and it's going to be even more difficult now that slaves are gone, that labor source is gone, and for decades, the South is going to be the poorest section of the nation, okay? And again, I say some people argue it is still that way today. We are still trying to overcome the devastation by the Civil War on a lot of different levels. What is the economic impact on the North, okay, and the Midwest? Well, we mentioned this, okay? The North is known for its industrial economy. That industrial economy is going to be very, very strong, okay, after the war. It's going to lay the foundation for industrialization. That's going to be something we talk about later down the road. In the next half century, okay, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we're going to begin to industrialize, and the North is going to pave the way. And because of the strong northern economy, like I said before, the U.S. is going to become a global economic powerhouse, which is going to be important because that means we're going to have roles in things like, World War I and World War II. Okay, so the North is becoming a very, very strong industrial economy, while the South is still keeping up with its devastating agricultural economy, trying to overcome that. What's the political impact on the Civil War? Well, we talked about that. The federal government becomes stronger. Now, the country in some ways becomes more unified, okay? We come back from the brink of disunion. Excuse me. So the government is going to become stronger. It's going to become more unified. Sadly, in some respects, or in some people's opinions, it's also going to be a bigger part of our everyday lives. And we mentioned signing up for the draft, and we mentioned the economic impact of the income tax and things like that. So while the federal government is becoming stronger, and in some respects we're answering that question that we talked about way back with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the national government, the unified national government, is stronger than the state governments. Okay, and it's becoming more of a power in everyday life for America. And then last but not least, what is the social impact of the Civil War on the nation? It's the fact that we have a lot of death, okay? 600,000 plus Americans die. Southerners are left embittered by their losses. We're going to hear this a lot with Reconstruction. We're going to hear it after Reconstruction a lot. The question remains, how are we going to put the nation back together emotionally and politically? And we're going to try to answer that with Reconstruction. And we're going to ultimately, I'll be honest with you, we're going to ultimately find that Reconstruction is a huge failure. And a lot of this bitterness and things like that, that's going to remain in the years to come. All right. Now, that photograph right there is a picture of the dead of Antietam. And to illustrate how this number of 600,000 is fluctuating and tends to be going up, just recently they found some more burial maps for Antietam. And they have discovered that the bloodiest day of the American Civil War, Antietam, is a lot bloodier than we originally thought. The casualty rates at Antietam are much, much higher than we originally thought. Okay, so that 600,000 Americans die, that's going to be a little bit, I think that's a little bit higher today. Okay. Well, that's it for the last unit on the Civil War. We, like I said, we're going to pick up with this legacy. This is going to lead us into our next unit, which is going to be Reconstruction.